Clabberton. Welcome to Conversing.
What a gift it is today to welcome Dr. Uli Chi as our guest on Conversing. Uli Chi is a man who has lived most of his life in the northwest part of the United States and is a person whose leadership has extended into for-profit businesses, nonprofit organizations, the Theological Academy, and has gained in all of these places and contributed in all these places a great wealth of wisdom. He is a technology entrepreneur. He founded a software company that developed 3D virtual reality software that has helped revolutionize a whole variety of experiences and processes for consumers and businesses alike. His insight and his experiences are in high demand, and he's been a person that has served in community contexts, particularly in medical organizations, such as the Virginia Mason Franciscan Health Center in the Pacific Northwest, the Benaroya Research Institute, and the Virginia Mason Institute, all in Seattle. He's also been an important part of the Pree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary, and he serves there as the vice chair of that center. It's a great, great gift to have him today as we discuss his most recent book entitled The Wise Leader. Uli, thank you so much for joining Conversing today. It's just really a great joy.
Oh, so glad to be here, Mark, with you. The privilege is all mine.
Well, let's start with me telling a little story that I'd like you to react to. So, Wisdom and this amazing book that I want to encourage people to read called The Wise Leader is a new book that you have just written, and it's one that is beginning to make the rounds. And I want to use this as an example of why I think this book is so compellingly important. I heard recently about someone who on an airplane encountered one of the main academic leaders of one of the leading institutions in the United States, and they had a chance for an unexpected conversation. And when my friend expressed that what she was working on involved character formation, he used examples like, first, like the Boy Scouts, and like what you're really doing then is you're hoping for the McDonaldization of character. Now, this was spoken of by a person who, if their name was used, would astound you, because you would think, I would think, that they would be a person whose whole life could have been given to the pursuit of wisdom. And yet, character, wisdom, the depths that we're trying to get at here, in his mind, involves something akin to Boy Scout experiences and McDonaldization in the sense of scale. So, as you hear that story, tell us why we need a book called The Wise Leader.
Wow, what a great story, and tragic, I guess. This may be a more apt description of it. I think the truth is that wisdom is, such a, in one way, such a complex thing. It's in a certain sense, the way I've tried to describe it, it's the art of becoming fully human. So it's in many ways the exact opposite of what your friend was describing. This, and I think that's much more of a caricature, I think, of wisdom is, at least a biblical understanding, my understanding of being wise is to develop in our full humanity and all its capacities it means emotional maturity, it means intellectual maturity, it means, volitional maturity too, the choices we make, that we choose to do what is good rather than what is not. And oftentimes it's complicated, right? I mean, so much of my life and my experience is that often choices are not between what is obviously good or bad, but between what is sometimes bad and worse. I mean, there's the realities you face as a leader. And so I think, particularly today, I think where life has gotten so complicated, I've said before in my I've been a technologist most of my life. My business has been in technology, and literally the knowledge has exploded. Information technology's exploded. We know, orders of magnitude more than we, information-wise and knowledge-wise and even skill-wise than we knew, 50 years ago. And yet we seem to be none the wiser, right? I mean, we still struggle.
Yes.
What do you make of all of this? What's the meaning of all of this? How do we live? And how are we to be human in the midst of all this? And
Yes.
At least in my area that I tend to live in technology spaces or technology-related spaces, there are all sorts of questions about, what are the limits of our humanity, right? Or what are the and they're being challenged, right? Whether technologically with artificial intelligence or with biology, that with gene splicing, I mean, you can change the code of life. I mean, we seem to have the ability to literally change who we are at the physical level. Now, I think we need more than McDonald's or Boy Scouts to help us figure that piece of it out, right? So
Yes. I do think when people use the word wisdom, which I think is not a word that is frequently used actually these days, but when people say they're interested in what is wise or that they're pursuing wisdom, what do you think most people are holding in their mind? And then how alike or unalike would you say your vision of what wisdom is about would be?
Well, I think, Mark, that's a great question. I'd love to hear your answer to that question, actually, as well as my own. My picture of wisdom has been sort of like the sage sitting on a mountaintop somewhere, who knows the answers to some secret questions about life or something. And I think it's I guess a couple of aspects to it. One is, I think, in my experience, that people are looking for secrets to success or ways of navigating life that enable them to be successful. It's almost a functional view of wisdom, right? And my argument in the book very much is that my understanding of biblical wisdom is it's fundamentally relational. It's about our relationship. It's so deeply ingrained to you. It's deeply rooted in who God is and who we are as persons and being persons in relationship and being wise in those relationships. How do we relate to one another? And I think it's not about sort of finding the 5 secrets to life or something. So I think that's one aspect. I think the other aspect that struck me, I don't know if this is really part of your question, but it strikes me that what people are looking for is sort of individualized wisdom, right? And I think biblically, wisdom is fundamentally a communal trait, right? You don't actually become, I've, one of these, perhaps to my own sadness, it's hard to be wise on your own, right? And the wise leader in that sense perhaps is a misnomer, right? It's not about an individual. It's really about learning how to be to understand and appreciate and to tap into the wisdom of the community. And even leadership itself, as I argue in the book, is more of a team sport than an individual sport. I mean, we live, as you and I both know, having grown up in the North American leadership context, it's a very sort of heroic model of leaders, right? That we got to be the great ones who do great things, whether for God or for anyone else, right? But it's not, I don't think that's the biblical image at all. I think that we are called to be, that leadership, I guess a simple way for me to capture it is that leadership is a team sport, not an individual sport.
Yes. Right. I do think that theological framing that you're giving it is so important to recover, because the wisdom that is often being snatched for is the bit that's going to make the difference in something that we are trying to achieve, as opposed to a way of being, a way of living, wisdom as a way of embodying a lifestyle in communion with other people. That's really where wisdom is found, and it's what it's meant for, much more than the advice that might be pragmatic and useful and maybe even good and constructive advice that might just, fill that certain hole. But that's not really the depth and range of what wisdom is really about. But it is, I think, very important to dwell in this space of understanding. Maybe you could write a companion volume to this that's called The Wise Community, because I think you say a lot in the book about the fact that it is relational. You start there at the beginning of the book, and it does follow you all the way through. So maybe you've actually already written that book inside this one. But do you want to comment on that? Just expand more on that communal element, the relational element, why it is that it's not just a personalized thing.
Yeah, no. Can I say something about the other thing you said? I thought you said
Please.
it really well, actually better than in my response. I think this business of really wisdom is about a way of being and about a way of life. I couldn't agree more. I think the nature of wisdom is it's not only a way of being and a way of life, but it's a journey, right? And I think then part of the nature, you never arrive in this life.
Right.
And
right.
that fundamentally in that sense, we're always learners on the way of wisdom. We're never, again, this picture of there being that wisdom somehow has an arrival state in this life, which is, I think, people want to become wise, but in a certain sense, becoming wise is in part knowing that there's a lot more to know, right? And a lot more to discover, a lot more to learn from. So I think that I just so appreciate the way you said that. So thank you. So the other is on the communal piece. I think, my own experience of learning leadership sort of in the context of North America in particular, I think it's tended to be very individualized, as I said before. And I think what that misses is the opportunity, one, to learn from others, but in particular to learn from others who are not like us. I think one of the things I've reflected on the book is, I talked about my wife, Gail, and I, and actually a colleague of yours from Fuller helped us when we were we were empty nesters. This was about 20 years ago, and we were wondering what we were going to do with the rest of our lives. And so she was the associate dean of the School of Psychology at the time. Anyway, So we asked her to help us to sort of figure out what we were going to do together. And so she said, well, why don't we give you a battery of psychology tests, state-of-the-art stuff. And I said, great. And so we took the instrument, she had it processed, and she sat down with us at our coffee table in our living room, and she started to laugh. And I said, what's so funny? She says, I'm amazed you're still together. You're so different on every scale imaginable on the test. We were at opposite ends. And I have to admit, Mark, I think one of my learnings on the way of wisdom is to appreciate the difference. I think early on in our relationship, I don't think I would ever have said this to my wife, Gail. I saw her opposites as being weaknesses to my strengths, right?
Yes.
And I think one of the things I've learned on the way of wisdom is how to appreciate those who have very different strengths than I do. And I think I have to admit, again, in my leadership work, that I tend, and this in some ways it's natural. You attract people who are like you, right? You tend to associate with people who think like you do, who sort of, I'm an idea guy, I'm a strategy guy. So I tend to, in my leadership team, when I was running my company, I attracted a lot of executives like that, and I had to consciously work to find those who thought differently than I did, who had different gifts than I did, because they were harder to, in a certain sense, interact with, because it was out of my range in some ways, right? But yet, great wisdom came out of that for me. I mean, I think people, just the way Gail does for me in my own life, is, she sees and says things that, at one level catches me off guard, and it sometimes annoys me, right? It's sort of like,
right, sure.
Because you saw something I didn't see, and you were absolutely right.
I think that it's interesting, if you don't mind just exploring a little bit more that contrast, because I can imagine the contrast between you and Gail was made up of many parts, and this is not a therapy session, but I do wonder if part of it was this difference, part of it was both of you having strong gifts and personalities that lean in different directions. Yes. But how much was gender itself at the time that you were married and so forth? Do you think honestly that it was also related to any lurking patriarchy in you, or was that really not a big factor?
Oh no, absolutely was. I think it's so many ways and so many levels that in some ways I'm sure I'm still unpacking in my own life. I think I grew up both, my father was Chinese, my mother was German. And so the Chinese culture can be more patriarchal, often was. And I think as early on in the Christian context that I grew up in, it was sort of the man was the head of the wife. And, and I think it was just easy to view that I was supposed to be right. And she was, I had to have the right answers. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think learning to receive her gifts, and she, as you said, she's an artist. I'm more of a mathematician, right? I said in my book, that's how I was trained. And I tend to be more a left brain kind of person. And she's a wonderful watercolorist. And, she does things with art that I just can't even imagine. And I think she sees the world differently as a result. And as a woman, she sees things differently.
Right.
And I think I oftentimes, this may relate to a lot of them, perhaps men in the audience, I found most of in my conversations with her about life, oftentimes I was trying to solve whatever problem she was talking about. And I had to, it took me a long, I hate to admit it, true confessions time. It took me years, if not decades, to finally say, are you just telling me this? So you want me to listen, or do you want me to actually offer some insights or maybe some ideas? And 9 times out of 10, she says, I just want you to listen. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Now I get it.
Yes.
Right? And so
right. I
think those kinds of differences in our relationship, and I'm sure it's different for different couples how this works, but I think in I think I did grow up in a very patriarchal model, and I've come so to appreciate the giftings of and perspectives of men and women versus men. I don't know if this is, if you wouldn't mind if I segued into this. One of the things I learned about that difference was in a board relationship context. I was as a board chair, I've often been puzzled and sometimes troubled by that the women in my board context often were quieter than the men. Men were much more vocal and so on. And so and these were very, very senior people who, served on public boards. And so I took one of them out to lunch one day. I said, help me understand what's going on. How can and when she spoke, it was like the old E.F. Hutton commercial. When she spoke, people listened. I said, so why don't you speak more? That isn't exactly how I said it. I said, how can I help create a context where you can feel more able to contribute? And she said 2 things that were startling. She said, and they were sort of obvious in retrospect. One thing she said was, when you want my opinion on something, ask me. I said, oh, okay, that's a good idea, right?
There's a thought.
And secondly, she said, when you agree with something I said, tell me in public. And one thing she said, and she told story after story of her own, and this wasn't just with me, but in her experience as a woman, as a senior woman in leadership. She said, more over and over, men would agree with other men over things that she had already said before, and they said nothing. And I said, oh my gosh, I recognize, I hate to admit it, I recognize myself in that. And so it changed the way I practiced board leadership. I said, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to, for one thing, just create space at the end of a board meeting to go around the circle and say, anything anyone wants to say. Sometimes people just don't have space. And secondly, I try to go out of my way to say, when somebody, she said, not just she, but other women on the board say, that was a great idea. Thank you for saying that. And I still catch myself, this is so bizarre, wanting to agree with the men and not saying it to the woman who said exactly the same thing. It's just, I don't know what that says about me or about sort of our practice, but I find that was an extraordinarily helpful insight. Because I think when we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, these things that I think are in many ways deeply biblical notions, that it's not just about creating a seat at the table for people. It's actually being able to create a culture that allows people to engage who are not necessarily all sort of type A, alpha male, outspoken people. And it isn't that people are who they are, right? So it's okay that we have some of those in the room. But part of my job as board chair is to make sure they're not the only voices in the room. And I don't think you can have diversity and equity and inclusion if you're not willing to deal with the cultural piece as well as simply providing a seat.
Right. I do think what we're exploring at the moment is this extremely important thing to understand, which is that wisdom is a labyrinth, and that it's embedded and intertwined and discovered in the context of so many other factors that influence us. In this case, we're talking about gender, race, the way that influences like patriarchy and other things can be so deeply embedded in us that we try to add wisdom on top of that until, I would say by God's grace, it gets appropriately named, called out, repented of, and practiced in a different way, right? And that is part of wisdom's journey as well. And whether it relates to the categories we're using right now, or whether it's in other areas of life, we can carry such significant biases that make the way of wisdom in that relationship or in that community of labor that might be a board or might be a team of workers together, or a family or a neighborhood or a town, be able to move forward is really dependent on a capacity to move beyond those categories. Wisdom is a deeper category that ultimately, I think, purges us, is meant to purge us of the things that are these practices that are just cultural habits that we want to call wise, but which are often just nothing more than cultural habits. They're not grounded in any particular wisdom except repetition.
Yes. Well, that's such a great insight. That's just a great way to describe it, Mark. And you should write a book on that.
One of the great things about this book is that at the beginning, you have this really beautiful picture of yourself as a little boy. It looks like you're maybe 3 or 4 or something like that, in the arms of your Chinese grandfather. And he's showing you his garden, and you feel and describe in the book the tenderness and the sense of place and the groundedness of his life. So the interesting thing about your dual background, I'd want to pull out a little bit on that theme. So you do have these two different cultures, German and Chinese, that are influencing you. On the Chinese side, one of the things that is so significant, and you explore this in the books in a beautiful way, is the way that gardening as an image really is about something that needs to be tended as opposed to managed or simply ordered. And I guess I'm wondering, there's a great deal in Eastern traditions, religious as well as philosophical, that are all about wisdom, all about the pursuit of wisdom in different ways, right? And so I guess I'm just curious how that side of your development alongside your Christian upbringing got named or understood by you as you were growing up or as you've become an adult and led in companies and organizations.
Well, my wife's the gardener and I'm not. That's the first conversion, right? But I think you're absolutely right. I think there's sort of, and I wish, I left Taiwan when I was fairly young. I was 6. And I wish I'd known my grandfather. He was quite, as I talk about in the book, he was a remarkable man. And this is not quite in response to your question, but I think just one more comment is my dad spent a lot of his time in Germany. So in many ways, even though he was Chinese, he had this sort of multicultural dimension to his own life.
Yes, interesting.
Which I sort of inherited. So I think the Chinese context has always been important in my family, but I think, the Chinese philosophical culture is not something we talked a lot about as a family. It sort of was just sort of lived, but I think there is a, and have you said that, I'm sort of been explicitly a student of Chinese philosophy. I think there is a real rootedness in the reality of organic spaces and places like gardens. That I think part of my Chinese upbringing made me more sensitive to the fact that life is more than just an intellectual exercise. That philosophy is not just, and as much as I love academic life in many ways, as as a
Sure.
student, there is a rootedness in reality as a physical, and not just a physical thing, but as an organic thing, right? That life it has a dynamism of its own, and that wisdom is not a static thing. That
Right.
I think sometimes we figure that there are certain sets of abstract, ideal questions that need to be answered, and yet life itself raises more questions as we go. And the questions we're asking today about being human, I think, are very different than they were 2,000 years ago in one sense, right? So just like
Or
what we were
even
talking
20.
about, we've already talked about it with AI or biology.
Yes.
I think there is an organic sense that wisdom needs to be. It goes back to your original comment about wisdom being a way of being and a way of life. That it too is something that grows with time, right? And that it like a garden, it doesn't stay static. Right? The questions themselves change over time.
Yes.
And so the answer that may have been great for 100 years, it's not like there are no, insights that last for a long time or maybe even are eternal, but that somehow life itself is more than that, right? Life is more than a set of abstract ideas. I think in many ways, and I think actually your insight that maybe that's deeply rooted in my Chinese culture more than the German one, which tends to be a bit more abstract. Right?
Yes,
So,
yes.
yeah.
Well, certainly it's the case that Chinese philosophy is really both philosophical and as you said so well, it's grounded in physical existence and experience and the earth and the way that things are, quote unquote, rather than in a kind of abstraction. So, you're a scientist, you're a very thoughtful person, you're a technologist, you are a person who's intersected with science and technology in your business life. And as you said earlier, we're living in an era in which technology is ever more dominating, I think is the word that I would use, ever more dominating in our life. And so much for the good in many, many ways, which we could easily all point to and be grateful for. And in ways that we find also challenging, complicated, changing. To some degree, we currently are in a period, especially with the explosive growth of AI, we're in a period of another level of adjustment to technology in which it now self-generative AI is really proposing to us a world that we literally are already experiencing, but which we can only imagine we will experience in ways that we literally can't imagine. We can imagine not imagining well today what that world is going to be like. So where does wisdom fit in your architecture in a world of technology, and how does its urgency and importance unfold specifically in that context that you've lived and worked in through your whole life?
Well, I think, if you go back to I hate to use the word definition, but my description perhaps of wisdom as being the art of becoming fully human, I think fundamentally wisdom raises the question of who are we and why are we here and what are we about? Those are large, large questions that keep evolving. And as we've talked about, technology in a certain sense pushes against what our prior definitions have been, right? I think for me, one of the great helpful insights of the biblical revelation is that humanity has been entrusted by God with stewardship for the creation itself. And that's where Genesis begins, that's where Revelation ends, right? That somehow we've been given, the language is used of dominion and reigning, but actually it's, as you know, it's more about stewardship. It's about responsibility for caring for the creation in the way that God would care for it. And so I think a couple of things in particular, and in regard to both AI, information technology, and biological technology, I think fundamental to the challenge in front of us, where wisdom is needed, is to really discern thoughtfully and in community about the question, how do we remain responsible stewards of what we're creating, right? And what the technology enables us to create. Technology essentially is an amplifier. AI, for all its promises, is an amplification and of human capacity. And so one issue I think where wisdom can both be helpful and is necessary is we need to figure out how to retain our responsibility or our agency without abdicating that to the technology. And I think that's one of the great dangers of AI, is AI can, as I've said sort of briefly, is, technology in whatever form is a great servant but a terrible master, right? And so we need to not in an arrogant way or in a over-controlling way, because a lot of this is to be discovered, right? We don't know all the right answer. We can't simply legislate what the right answer is to questions that we don't even understand yet, maybe that we haven't even asked yet. So we need genuine human wisdom and the Spirit of God active in our lives to help us navigate this time. And I think we're in sort of another, juncture, another inflection point, I think, with both AI and with genetics, that we need more thoughtful, Christian, wise people. That's why I think the Christian insights, and I'm a big, as you can tell from my book, one of my arguments is we've sort of relegated a lot of Christian wisdom to sort of, that's not relevant, and I've used the imagery of sort of the lost Rembrandt in our cultural attic, that people treat it like it's irrelevant. And a lot of the folks serious, thoughtful, secular, caring people sort of say, well, that has nothing to offer. And I think, au contraire. I think, we know that there is considerable resources and wisdom in ways that the church hasn't always been good at applying, but that can speak to this, because fundamentally, humanity has an obligation to be responsible and accountable before God with what we're creating with these technologies. And so we need wisdom to navigate. I don't know what the right answers are, quite frankly. And I think there may be things possible that I would be really surprised and maybe even not be terribly excited about at this moment. But there are things that I think we need wisdom to navigate, to discern as we navigate this season of humanity's existence.
And using that very vortex that you're describing, then it has to do with what are the assets, the substantial assets that a wise form of Christianity might bring to the table. I'm here thinking about so much Christian press and so much press about Christians would suggest that the church is more full of folly at lots of levels than it is of wisdom. And furthermore, that's demonstrated in part by the failure to connect what we say and what we do, as well as the things that we are even wanting to say or claim or wanting to do. And I just think that location, that's why this moment and this book, it seems to me, is such a significant and timely contribution, because we are living in a period where people are just snagging, grabbing whatever they can find as a bit of perspective. It's a little bit like the song that Wisconsin Public Radio a number of years ago had written, where a guy is wandering around in a big box construction store and as the refrain keeps saying over and over again, I'm wandering around trying to find somebody who knows what they're doing. And how many times have I wandered into such a store just trying to find anybody who knows what they're doing? Yeah. And I think as a culture, we're full of lots of people and places and circumstances where people are just literally wandering around trying to find somebody who knows what they're doing. And if the church is meant to be an evidence of that, then we're certainly not in a thriving season in demonstrating that kind of wisdom, which again is why I think what you're trying to provide is so important, because it's thoughtful, it's clarifying, it's biblical, it's personal, it's relational, it's historic, but it's not abstract, it's not distant, it's not disconnected from a changing, volatile, technological, scientific world. It lands in all of those real places that we all live.
Amen. I think, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, back to what we were talking about earlier, I think we're going to need communal wisdom for this.
Yes.
Right? There's
yes.
nobody smart enough. No one is smart enough to figure this out on their own. And we need to, and we need, the other thing we need is epistemological humility, right? We need to recognize that we not only don't we know, but that we're likely wrong about a number of things, whether technically or theologically or even morally on some issues that we felt so sure about. And I know that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but I think we need to be willing to, and I think the church, one of my great hopes for the church, and we haven't really talked about this, is that I think in many ways the church is the place where we should be able to model unity and genuine love and willingness and humility to hear one another.
Yes,
and yet we're
yes.
doing, in many cases, some of the worst jobs of that, right? Which is very sad to me. I think there are evidences to the contrary of that, what I just said.
Yes,
and I think
absolutely.
there's a chance for us to be genuine light, right?
Yes.
Because I think ultimately the church is held together because of our common commitment to Jesus and to God. And that's the fundamental thing that holds, nothing else is actually the basis for that unity. And that gives us the ability to process some of these difficult questions where we disagree. And I think if the church actually followed what Jesus said sort of at the end of his life on earth, that love one another and be one, right? If we could model that, I think there are so many in the world who are craving that kind of ability to model a different way of being human too, in that sense, right?
Right.
I'm Mark Labberton. You're listening to Conversing.
Well, I think as sad as many things in the American church are for me, one of the things that's a counterpoint to that, that's a deep and significant counterpoint is, for example, I just recently came in touch with some research that's been done about collective agencies or groups or organizations within communities in America that are doing good, seeking the common good. And in almost every city and in almost every state, by a serious factor, Christian organizations are the primary social service enterprises that are taking society and its needy people and needy circumstances with the greatest outreach. And while there's plenty of other organizations, of course, that are seeking the common good, by no means are they all Christian, but it's a moving fact to me that embedded in the way that we do life together are often organizations frequently unsung, underseen, underknown, that are actually the embodiment of a great deal of wisdom.
Yes.
But they just get on with it.
Yes.
They're not, their business, their wisdom is not the wisdom of self-promotion.
Right.
Their business is actually doing the work, being the people, delivering the services and provisions that may be needed. Right. And I do find that an important counterpoint as I sometimes wallow around in my dismay at what the church in America is and isn't. So,
oh, that's really true, Mark. And it is easy to focus on the negative, and it's an expression of the fact that the gospel, in fact, transforms, right? It transforms people, transforms organizations, and it has and will continue to transform society, I think.
In addition to technology, you've been deeply immersed and involved in medicine and medical enterprises, hospitals and agencies, as I said in the introduction. And I wonder, as you think about this theme of wisdom, and the book gives us tastings of this, but just for those who haven't yet read the book, what is wisdom that's needed in the context of a very complicated, technologically influenced and ever more defining field like medicine? What is the wisdom of human caregiving? What does that mean in hospital settings and other kinds of clinical contexts?
Boy, that's a great question, Mark. And, we've been just through this once in a, hopefully 100 years pandemic where we've seen the stresses on our healthcare system. I've watched so many deeply committed people who are caring for folks who have literally been pushed to the edge of saying, I'm done because I can't do this anymore. Right. And thankfully that's not everyone, and thankfully most. But I think the challenge of learning how to, T.S. Eliot's phrase, to care and not to care, I think was one aspect of wisdom, that you can't do it all. I think we get, and this goes back to a number of other aspects of wisdom, that we recognize as human beings, we have limits.
Right.
And that God alone can do certain things that we are incapable of doing. And I think in a world, in a secularized world where it's all up to us, it's either go to despair or to cynicism and just say,
yes,
I just can't do this anymore. But I think the folks who are hanging in there see that they have and there's so many of, I can think of individual faces, even as we're talking, of folks who just care deeply for those who are suffering and want to make a difference and do on a daily basis, literally save lives. Not just metaphorically, they're literally saving people's lives. And it's in many cases at great cost to themselves.
Yes.
But I think part of wisdom is learning how to care for others while you're also making sure that you're stewarding the gift that is you, right? And this is where Eliot's phrase has been helpful to me, even as somebody. My mother was a great caring person, and I think she taught me how to care, but not always how not to care. I have to stop. Right, this is enough. And
finitude is real.
Yeah, and that there are others who can come alongside, right? And it doesn't become just about you and what your gifts are and what your ability to meet those needs are. So I think in healthcare, that's one big issue, because we're seeing, again, the challenge of having the needs exploding and having, in a certain sense, not quite enough folks to provide the needs, at least the way we've done them before. And again, we need wisdom to be creative in response. So we, for example, in nursing care, one of the things that the nursing leader that I know in our region has been championing team-based nursing care, which is really interesting because nurses, you tend to think of one nurse taking care of one patient. And this radical notion is maybe we ought to think about it as a team of people, and you can actually care for people in a way that is better for, not only it's better for the patient, but also helps the nurses that they don't feel like they're stressed and are burned out.
Yes, yes.
And as another example, I think where wisdom and technology sort of combine together is we've developed, not just we, but healthcare in general has developed the capacity to do virtual nursing, where you can have nurses attend to patients from a distance. Now that sounds impersonal, but actually what it's doing is it extends people's capacity to do nursing, because some folks just can't do it anymore physically at the kind of requirements of being at bedside. So you still obviously need bedside nurses, but there are those nurses who, whether because of age and physical limitations or because of family issues, in terms of that they can actually do this remotely, and actually you get better care in the process. I think those are wonderful examples where the need, wisdom is actually one of the dimensions of wisdom, is that we are able to respond in a way that helps everyone to flourish, not just the patients, not just the caregivers, but the whole community as a whole.
Right, right. I do think that in my own experience as a pastor, having been in hospital rooms hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, how much variety there is in the quality of care that's being given. And some of that has to do with the kind of insurance that a person might have, the kind of facility that someone might be in, the financial resources. But I have to say that one of the things that has been prominent to me has been the working philosophy of what that particular institution believes is their task. And if they don't see the person really as the primary point of concern and service, and instead see it more like a set of functional tasks that need to be done in order to get on to the next person or the next bed or the next body that needs attention. It's a really different standard of care,
Yes.
even when it's not necessarily the most lavishly funded facility. You can sense a deep permeating care in many facilities. Like you can sense the absence of that sometimes in facilities that may be much more heavily funded, but they don't convey a sense of connectedness to the people that are actually being served.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think, I've been associated with a Catholic health system now for a number of years. And one of the things I so appreciate about it is the sense of the missional undergirding of why are we doing what we're doing is deeply rooted in, it's actually very explicit in this mission statement. This is a healing ministry of Christ, that we're here to treat all human beings as being made in the image of God and to provide care because they're of value, right? No matter where they're coming from. And I think this, in many ways, it's sort of the Christian vision of what it means to be human, that every human being deserves that, right? And that's not just a mission statement somebody thought was a good idea. It's deeply rooted in a fundamental view of what reality looks like. And I think that's where the Christian vision of wisdom is so powerful. Is, one of the things I've discovered in my interactions with, we've put together 2 health systems recently in our region, one which is Catholic and the other which is secular in its heritage. And one of the interesting things that I've observed is that many of my secular colleagues actually have many of the same, care about the same things in terms of caring for the vulnerable, treating people with dignity and so on. And I think, they do a wonderful job in some cases of challenging us to care for. In fact, this system, Virginia Mason, that's the secular piece of our system, has a long and distinguished history. They did one of the early care facilities for those who were suffering from HIV/AIDS. When many of those of us who were even Catholic or who had sort of Christian convictions were sort of reticent because we're concerned about transmission and issues, but they were willing to take the risk. And so, so they really, I think, lived that in a way that challenges some of us to, about our own sets of values. And so, and one of the joys has been sort of to try to bridge the gap in terms of trying to articulate different ways of seeing the same things, caring about the same values. But one of the things I've said to my secular colleagues is that the importance of the Christian vision is that it provides a much deeper foundation for our understanding of being human that isn't just a vagary, a choice that somebody decided they thought was a good idea, or that might change because somebody else decides that they have a better idea, right? So I think this sort of ancient wisdom is so important because it provides a sort of a bedrock for those values that actually many secular people care about the most, right? Whether it's care for the planet, whether it's care for human beings and the vulnerable. And so I think that's one of the values of having a Christian vision of wisdom that allows us to provide something that is more durable ultimately. That doesn't just change with, and because so many things are changing, it's helpful to have some bedrock, right? To be able to build upon.
One of the things that you just said about the willingness of Virginia Mason, for example, to have the wisdom and the freedom to care for HIV patients early in that crisis is really an example of how wisdom and freedom belong together. And I think one of the things that comes out in your book is that wisdom is not a gateway toward constraint, which it can sometimes be. It can actually also be a source of liberation in being able then to do and be the right thing. I'm just curious if you want to expand on that, because I think that freedom is not often associated with wisdom, which always feels like it's protective, guarded, conservative in that sense.
No,
as opposed to liberating, which is also what wisdom should be.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think, again, it's actually the way you put that is, I think, one of my favorite translations of Matthew 11 about come to me, all you who are weary. It's from Eugene Peterson, where he talks about come and learn how to live freely and lightly.
Yes.
And I think
yes.
wisdom actually helps us to live freely and lightly. One of the things I talk about in the book is that there's a playful and there's a playful quality to wisdom.
Yes.
That I think, in some ways, wisdom, you tend to think of as a really serious, and it is, a serious, being morally serious, being thoughtful and so on. But there's a sense in which there's a playful quality to God's wisdom. And I talk about, there's a passage of Proverbs 8 about, wisdom being there at the foundation of creation. And part of the language there is that it was playing, right? And so there's that delight and the joy. And I talk about that with my grandfather. There's sort of a joy to discovering these things that are so wonderful and are expansive rather than being constraining and narrowing. And I think that's really part of what wisdom's intended to do.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it. I think one of the things that strikes me too is that there's a way that we can understand wisdom to be find the perfect solution and do the perfect thing. And that sort of picture of wisdom is all performative and it's all benchmarked by the perfection of often an abstract sense of what is the perfect good. Whereas part of wisdom for human beings involves accepting our humanity, that we get to do life as mortal beings, that we get to do life as finite beings. And certainly the Christian faith would say we also do life as fallen beings, that we're not all that we might be. But in the middle of all that, wisdom also doesn't expect of us something that can only be expected of God. So part of the liberty that I think wisdom brings is the freedom that I really am not God, that you're not God, that a system is not God, that a church, a denomination is not God. And that in that comes then the room for greater and more liberating tenuousness at times, but also confidence at times. And I just think that's a very, very key piece of what your book is really pointing to. And I think that it is part of the trajectory of freedom that does lead even to the play of wisdom and not just the seriousness of wisdom.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think my model of wisdom, in particularly early on in my life and career, was of something that was, was, like you say, it had sort of an abstract quality to it. It had sort of a perfectionist sense of, once I get to the top of the mountain, then I'll know, right? I'll know what this thing is. But I think this sort of paradox, which often is how wisdom comes to us as human beings, is there is a sense in which it is expansive and playful, and yet it recognizes that part of that is that we're finite. The gift of finitude, right? That we have been given our humanity. We're not to be like God in the sense of being all-knowing or all-powerful. And that's good. And that's a good thing. Right. And that
it is a good thing.
We can live, not only can we live with that, but we are meant to flourish in that sense.
Right. Yeah, I was talking recently to a friend of mine who was finding his work particularly burdensome, and it's serious work and it's extremely hard to do, and it's a team that is led, that's complicated in its own right. And in the process of all that, I just kept thinking, I've been in that space. I've lived in that sense of intersection where it can feel so onerous. But if in fact it's possible to hold this more, I would say, a wiser perspective in that moment, it isn't that you take the work any less seriously, but you're really clear that it doesn't finally rest on your own shoulders, and that you're not doing it alone, and that it gets to be a work in progress, and that time will unfold, and that over time we will continue to work at these sometimes perennial challenges that may be part of our work. And there's great joy in that, as well as then the deep furrowing work of trying to sometimes just keep moving forward when doing so is itself a challenge.
Mm. Yeah. No, isn't that the case?
Uli, when you think about the political moment that we're in right now, which is not something directly that I'm interested in talking about, though it would be fascinating
Thank
to
you.
do that, but I'm not going to put you on that hot seat. But when you think about the wisdom that's going to be needed for us as a nation, defending and protecting and enabling democracy to thrive, what is the role of wisdom in a democracy?
Wow. There were other voices who are wiser than I who can speak better to that, I suspect. But, at sort of a more intuitive level, I think wisdom, I learned a lot from one of your predecessors, Rich Mao, in terms of how to have civil conversations with those who disagree with you in the public space. And there are others, today, who are doing such great work in that area. But I think it's a lot of it goes back to the epistemological humility for me, just being willing to recognize that and to treat others, including those who are our political and theological enemies, which there are many, right? And I've even at a personal level, we've had folks leave our church over issues, right? That is. And political issues as well as moral issues or other issues, but being willing to treat them as, in a certain sense, the mysteries they are, right? Human beings are inherently, because we are created in the image of God, not reducible to an ideology, right? And that we are, and I think it's easy for me to do because it's easier to deal with it that way. Is we can put people in their boxes and then we know what we're going to do with them. But I think what God calls us and what Jesus calls us to do is to love human beings, others who are different and who are even as he said very directly, you're to love your enemies because that's what your father does.
Right.
If you're going to be like your father, that's what you've got to do. And that's really hard.
It is really hard.
Especially the enemies who live next door to us, as well as those who are, who live in Washington, D.C., perhaps, or something. But, I think just
as an example.
Yeah. But I think just having the recognition that, one, we don't know everything, and two, that what we know, in fact, could be wrong, even about things that we care the most deeply about. And being willing to be in relationship with people rather than, and actually spending the time to understand people. I've talked about, I think I said in my book that, I think one of the most hopeful things to sort of break the spell that seems to be cast upon all of us in this country is to be genuinely curious about other people, right? Because I think curiosity changes the way we think about things rather than, figuring out which box they belong in, whether they're okay or not, whether they're righteous or unrighteous, I think you say, why do you think that? And I find it's hard to do for me too, is to, with people I most deeply disagree with, to say, why do you think that? And not to either change their mind or to change my own mind, but just simply to try to understand them.
Right.
And I think if we don't start there, I think that's where wisdom starts for us. I think reminding us that's part of the fear of the Lord, in the sense that God has made us in his image. And, human beings are mysterious. We're not caricatures. Right. So.
Yeah, and we are embedded in narratives.
Yes.
That's I think why David Brooks suggests, in addition to the why question, the how question. How did you come to hold that view? Is an invitation to a storytelling.
Yes.
That's different than a
proposition
defending. Yeah, I think it's just incredibly important. There is a strong sense that love and wisdom are really seen best in the language of the Bible in Jesus Christ, who's the incarnation of wisdom and the embodiment of wisdom.
Yes.
And that the cross is the height of God's wisdom. Now, if you put those things together, it's enough to bend your mind and leave us speechless. But it's also an extraordinary invitation into a re-examination of the things that we presume are wise, which look and appear and often were treated as exactly the opposite of that. So that sense of immediacy and brand recognition and speed with which wisdom is discerned and thrown away, or not discerned and thrown away, is just really profound. And I wonder if you want to just maybe close our time together with some reflections on what you see as the arc of wisdom in a person's life. Jesus makes it clear that a young person can be wise as well as an older person. And it's not a direct correlation about simply being old makes you wise. But there is an arc of maturing, development, growth, change, etc. So how would you describe that arc in terms of wisdom?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. And I sort of argue in one of the last chapters in the book that I think the arc of wisdom is that you learn to become simultaneously childlike, youthful, and mature.
Yes.
It's not, I used to think that the arc of wisdom was you were childlike at the beginning of your life and you became mature. You become discerning and courageous in your actions as you get older, which is true. That's certainly an aspect of it.
Right.
But I think there's a childlike dimension. There's always a sense in which we are called to learn to trust and to be vulnerable to God and to others. And that doesn't stop. I mean, it's not surprising as you get old. I'm discovering, as I'm getting older, that I'm more dependent on other people, right? Because I'm physically less capable. I'm more dependent on other people's goodwill and capacities to help. But I think that's part of learning wisdom is there's a childlike quality to being vulnerable and to be willing to trust others.
Yes.
And I think the same thing could be said about sort of the youthful quality of being curious and playful. That too is not something you grow out of, but that you grow into.
Right.
In the same way you grow into trust and vulnerability, and that you grow into maturity and discernment and courage. And I think the challenge, the arc of wisdom is to simultaneously grow in all three dimensions. Because I think any one dimension is less, in a certain sense, less than fully human.
Yes.
We need all three capacities, I think, to really be fully human and wise. And I certainly hope that's the arc that I'm on.
Right. Amen. Well, I do think that for many people, wisdom is simply reified assumptions about the world that have come up to us through whatever means they come to us. And what you're portraying throughout this book and in what you just said is really a picture of lifelong development that invites us deeper, wider, higher, and broader in our ability to live in a complicated world, and to do that in a way that reflects the Creator, that reflects the Redeemer, but also reflects the character of a communion that is coming into being, and which in the life of the church or an individual Christian's life is meant to be increasingly manifest in every dimension of who we are. I say in the foreword to this book, which I had the privilege of writing, that one of the joys of reading this book is simply that you are such a manifestation of these things for me, Uli, and you've been that way for not only me, but for many, many other people in all the domains that I've encountered you in Christian higher education and in organizations of different kinds, in the work of the Pree Center at Fuller, and the work that you've done at Regent College, and the work that you've done through the hospitals and businesses that you have been serving. And I just want to say thank you for being a person who's pursuing wisdom and gives me an even greater appetite for continuing to grow in the same direction. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you for the joy of this conversation.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to Conversing on your favorite podcast app to listen to new episodes as they are released. And please leave a review. Conversing is produced by Peter Laberton and distributed by Fuller Studio.